On this episode of Tiny Bits of Bible Prophecy, we're going to be discussing Matthew chapter 24. Hi there, and welcome to Tiny Bits of Bible Prophecy. This is Charla, and she's going to show you where her nose is. Today we're going to be learning from Matthew chapter 24, and I'm going to give you commentary on each verse, so I hope you enjoy it. I made this graphic for you to take a screenshot of or stop and pause and write down for further Bible study. Mark chapter 13 is the same Olivet discourse or the Mount of Olives sermon that Jesus gave from a different perspective. So Matthew 24, that is writing from Matthew's perspective, and then Mark listened to the same sermon and wrote that in Mark chapter 13. So these are all of the verses from the beginning of chapter to the point where Jesus talks about the fig tree that are exactly the same. You can see that most of them are exactly the same. So this tells me that the disciples were really listening close to what Jesus had to say about end times, and I believe we should too. I'm going to be reading from the NIV version of the Bible, and we're just going to read straight from the Bible here. This is Matthew chapter 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all of these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Looking at verse 2 of Matthew chapter 24, we know that it is exactly like Mark chapter 13, verse 2. And also we know that the temple was destroyed in AD 70. That's when the Jewish people revolted against the Roman rule, and the Romans came in and destroyed the temple. That's currently how it was left. After that, the mosque was built on or next to the Temple Mount, and they're not even exactly sure where the Temple Mount is. I've done some reading, and King Herod had made the temple very fancy during Jesus' day. So, King Herod was the king that was around when Jesus was born. We know all of that, but we also know from history that he was a great architect, and he basically took the temple that was built by Ezra after it was destroyed by Babylon, and they came back and rebuilt the temple, as we know from the book of Daniel, that he took it and rebuilt it and made it into this spectacular building. They said that it was, there's Josephus is a Jewish scholar that wrote about the times of Jesus, and he said that it was covered in gold and I think granite. So it was very spectacular looking. So that is why the disciples, they're kind of like when you go to a big city, they're in awe of the building, the temple. And Jesus says, every one of the stones will not be left on one another, and everyone will be thrown down. Well, we know that has already happened. So we can look at this and know that 2, at least, verse 2, that's already happened. So we know that. And then they ask Jesus, and they ask him privately because they want to have a private conversation. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So they're asking Jesus a really controversial private question, and they really are hanging on every one of his words. Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear to deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. but the one who stands firm to end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back and get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray for your flight will not take place in the winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Okay, we're going to look at these verses and talk about if these have already happened or if they're yet future. So, verse 4, Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you." I think that's probably pretty good advice that we have known for the ages, and we can all probably agree that this has already happened and is currently happening. For many will come in my name, claiming I am Messiah, and will deceive many. I just encourage you to look up false messiahs. There have been a ton. So this is something that I believe has been fulfilled, but also will be fulfilled and is currently being fulfilled. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. So, verse 6, I know that in my lifetime, we have heard of rumors of wars. We have heard of wars, and we hear it all the time on the TV. This country hates us or hates another country, and they've made threats, or their army has shot down a drone, or we shot down something, or another country did this and that. Those are all rumors of war. So I think we can agree that those are happening now and have happened. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. This is interesting to me because we have since seen World War I and World War II. Those are the two largest wars ever on the planet, I believe, and they included the most countries in them. And so that's interesting to me. When I think about those wars, I think about this verse and the fact that we've seen that happen, and we could see it happen again. There will be famines, we've seen that, and earthquakes in various places. A lot of people read this as earthquakes and they forget to read the whole sentence. And earthquakes in various places. Various, that word can also mean diverse, and earthquakes usually happen around fault lines, and people are aware that they have earthquakes in those places. But there's been a large number of earthquakes in recent decades in weird places, like diverse places that don't usually have earthquakes. So I think that's what this means. And these are all the beginning of birth pains. So up until verse 9, all of the verses are pretty self-explanatory. We know that they have happened in the past, but they could also happen in the future. And then we get to verse 9. Then you will be handed over and persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. So this makes me think of two things. When it says you'll be handed over and persecuted and put to death, the Jewish people have endured years of suffering and been persecuted and put to death. And he is speaking to Jewish people at this point. But then he says, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. Well, Jewish people are not hated because of Jesus. So I wonder if he's speaking towards Christians at this point, believers in Jesus. So we know that many Christians have been persecuted and put to death. But to say that they're hated by all nations because of Jesus, I do not think that that has happened yet. We are seeing a change currently in the way people think of Christians, and we may be heading toward this. At that time, many will turn away from their faith and betray and hate each other. Well, we're kind of seeing the start of this, I believe, in the United States. I do not think that this has happened completely yet all over the world. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. So I think we can agree that some of this is kind of currently in play, and that we may be taking steps towards some of this. If verse 9 is speaking about Jewish people, then I think it's been fulfilled, but I think it's speaking of Christian people, because we'll be hated by all nations because of Jesus. So in that instance, I do not think that we've quite got to this point yet. Okay, we see in verse 13 that those who endure till the end will be saved. And then 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So this is something very specific, that the gospel will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So this is Jesus saying that all people of the world will hear his word, hear the gospel message before the end, and then the end will come. So nobody will go without hearing it before the end. Some people believe that that means that a Bible would be translated into every language. Some people believe that it means that everybody in the world will hear of Jesus' name and hear of the gospel message. They may not have a Bible in their language, but they may just hear it. And so we don't really know for sure how this will occur, but this is what this verse is saying, that everybody will have heard the good news of the gospel before the end. And so then 15, this is where our study of Daniel, why we started in Daniel, there are so many references to this for end time. We know that Daniel is speaking of end times, and this puts us right smack dab in the middle of the tribulation here. So it's verse 15, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So this is really important right here. It's in quotes because it is from Daniel, the abomination that causes desolation. So Daniel wrote this prophecy in chapter 11 and chapter 12 about the abomination that causes desolation. So this is the 3.5 year mark, or it happens after 1,260 days after the start of the tribulation, is when the Antichrist, which is the abomination that causes desolation, sets himself up in the temple in Jerusalem as God for people to worship him. And it's mentioned throughout the whole Bible. So this is not the only place, Daniel and then Matthew and Mark. We are going to get into that later on in Thessalonians and also in Revelation. And so this is a very important thing that Jesus wanted us to know about. And he's speaking to Jewish people, but they were followers of him. So keep that in mind. I also want to point out here on 15, there is no temple in Jerusalem right now. So again, we have Jesus telling us there's going to be a temple for the tribulation time. So that means they have to rebuild a temple before we can be in the 7 years of tribulation. And then it says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So once the people see the abomination that causes desolation, it is clearly telling them that are in Judea, which is Israel, to flee to the mountains. 17 says, let no one on the housetop go down and take anything out of the house. This tells me it's urgent. So like if you had a fire in your house, you wouldn't go take anything out of your house. You would just go. You would run out the house. 18 says, let no one in the field go back and get their cloak. So you don't even want to go back and get your coat. You just want to head toward the mountains when you see this. And it says specifically Judea. So we know this is Israel it's talking about. And number 19, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. If you're a woman listening to this verse always terrified me. But it is speaking to Jewish people right here. We can see it speaking to Judea, and we are not Judea here in America. That is a place. It is in Israel. So, for there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of world until now, and never equaled again. So this is telling us that the last half of the tribulation is going to be really, really bad, even worse than the first half. So we don't want to be there for that. So we're going to discuss where I think that we will be during all of this. And he's telling people what to look for if they are here. So this is very interesting to me that the first part of Matthew 24, verse 2 is very specific. The stones will be not left upon one another. The temple is going to be destroyed, basically, in Jerusalem. We know that happened in AD 70. There are some people that believe that all of Matthew 24 was fulfilled in AD 70, but the details don't match up, and there's a lot of things that didn't happen in AD 70 that are left unexplained. So in my opinion, and in many people's opinion, as we go through time, it was not fulfilled then. But the one thing that we do know for sure is verse 2 was fulfilled. So it's kind of like Jesus was saying, okay, here's the first thing. Then you're going to have all this other stuff happen. The other stuff is general. You know, we've seen some of that happen, and we've seen it happen 2 or 3 times. And we know that things are getting worse and they're ramping up, and that it is the beginning of birth pains. Those of us that have had the blessing of giving birth to a child know that those pains get more and more extreme as you get closer to giving birth. And that is a sign that more and more of that stuff will happen. And then we get down here to verse 13, 14, and 15, and it's more specific again. So Jesus is like, hey, this is all kind of, it's bad stuff that's going to happen. And then here's the specifics. So he really wants to narrow in on the last 3.5 years of the 7 years of tribulation, or the 70th week of Daniel. So we know that right here in verse 15, again, he is calling attention to the abomination that causes desolation. In verse 16, it mentions that they should flee from Judea to the mountains. Many people believe that our Bible study scholars, prophecy scholars, that means Petra. And Petra is in Jordan. And I included this picture from Wikipedia. You can go visit all about Petra there. Here is a reminder verse out of Daniel 9:27 about the abomination that causes desolation in the last 7 years. Here is yet another verse about the Antichrist, or the abomination that causes desolation, uttering blasphemous words and being able to allow to exercise authority for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. This verse here from Revelation 12:6, the woman in this verse is Israel, and this is talking about after Jesus says that the abomination that causes desolation sets up. This is where he tells the Jewish people to flee and hide in the mountains. And this says, which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Whenever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, in these verses, 22 says that the days will be cut short for the sake of the elect. This is really interesting because technically the way our earth spins, our days are getting longer. So this will be an obvious contrast to what we have now. And I don't think it'll just be we feel like things are going shorter. I think it'll actually be the days will be shortened. So this will be interesting for the people here on earth to see that the days will be cut short, because they wouldn't be able to handle it if they weren't. That's pretty bad. And at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. So there's going to be lots of false messiahs, lots of false information going around. Great signs and wonders are performed. And then Jesus says, see, I have told you ahead of time. I studied with the kids out of Exodus chapter 8, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And, a lot of times we don't talk about the fact that the magicians also did the signs, a lot of them. They did the blood in the Nile, they did the frogs, and many, many others. And people don't often talk about that. These are miracles that God did that these magicians that studied sorcery also did. So people will be deceived by numerous things that people are doing, magicians and practicers of dark arts. And then in 26, so if anyone tells you there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. So this is really interesting. So everyone here on the planet will see Christ coming. For as lightning comes from the east is visible even in the west. So that tells me it's gonna be a big deal. It's not just some dude out in the wilderness or in the field saying he's God. I'm not really sure what verse 28 means, and Bible scholars all disagree on that. Verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days. So he's going in and saying, okay, after all of this happens, it's going to get even worse. So here we go. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all of the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all of these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. At verse 29 and beyond, through verse 30 here, this is really talking about the very end. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to another. Right here at 31, from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other, that sounds like the sky to me. So my understanding of this is that this is the army of people that were believers that had either died previous to the 7 years or were raptured before the 7 years. And we're going to get to that belief that I have and many others have in a minute. But this verse here in Zechariah speaks of the armies that will enter with Jesus at the end. And it also speaks of, you will flee by my mountain valley, for it will extend to Ezel. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. I looked up this king, and they just recently, in 2019, did discover that there was a huge earthquake during his reign. Pretty interesting. This verse again in Revelation 19:14 is speaking of the armies of heaven following Jesus, riding on horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Let's continue on. The 32, it says, now this lesson from a fig tree. So right here, I believe that this verse, he's kind of like when you are speaking to a crowd and you tell the whole story and then you kind of recap. So he's kind of telling you a parable right here from the fig tree, and he's kind of recapping what he said. Now learn this lesson from a fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. So this is a pretty logical thing. So fig trees are very popular in Israel, that part of the world. We can think of other trees that we know whenever they bud, it's a certain time of year. Around here where I'm from in Missouri, I can think of the dogwoods and the redbuds. When they bud, we know that it's springtime. And so this is very similar to this. Even so, when you see these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. So when we see the signs that he told us about, we know that the end is coming. Truly, I tell you that this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened. There are many different interpretations upon this verse. Obviously, it was not talking about the disciples, because all of these things did not pass before they died. So even though he's speaking to the disciples, he's not telling them that they are the generation. Some people say that it's the generation that will see the coming back of Israel, and the average age of a generation is 70 to 80 years. It's been around that amount of time since Israel became a nation, and they're aligning that with the fig tree and its leaves blooming, because when Israel became a state again, a nation again, that was it blooming. And so the generation from then, some people have tried to say that. I see merit in that, but I also see that might be a bit of date setting. And some people say that just the generation that sees the things that happen within what Jesus is telling us will see the end. So that, I think, is the most correct idea. And it's not the general stuff that we talked about it earlier in the chapter. It's the specific stuff, like the abomination, all of that. So that is what I think this particular verse is saying. And then 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So right here, from the part about the fig tree to right here, he's kind of, wrapping up his speech and teaching us a parable lesson from the fig tree. And then he's going to kind of switch again in this next little segment. Israel became a nation May 14th, 1948. Next time on Tiny Bits of Bible Prophecy, we will continue in Matthew chapter 24, and we will discuss the day and the hour unknown, as well as the rapture and premillennialism.